from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the third week in a 6-week series entitled Our Dissolving Privacy, Who's Minding Your Business? On today's program, we're most fortunate to have a highly qualified individual to address a subtopic within that very, very broad and important issue, and that question is interpersonal relationships, and particularly addressing the role of the media in covering well-known celebrities. We're very pleased to welcome to the program Maria Wilhelm, who is with People magazine, and I have the pleasure of giving her background, and in a moment you'll see why it is so appropriate to have her on this program for this subject. Our guest is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate in the field of philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley. After graduating, Wilhelm, a San Francisco native, started with this particular magazine as a stringer in her hometown in the year 1980. Later, she was transferred to Washington, D.C., where she became People magazine's bureau chief at the beginning of 1989, and now she has moved on to New York City with People magazine, where she serves as chief of all correspondence and also an associate editor of People magazine. Ms. Wilhelm, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our community and to our state and certainly to this program. And we thank you for today for a most enlightened address to our community on the issue of privacy.
Thank you very much.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our regular panelists. First to my immediate left is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and she's also the clerk to the administrative judge of Northern Idaho. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Well, Maria, as Tony indicated in your introduction, you are with People magazine. When a story arises, how does People magazine decide whether they want to cover it, who they're going to send, what's going to happen with this story? Can you tell us?
Well, let's use as an example the Waco, Texas situation, which I take it is still unresolved. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. There is the question of the general newsworthiness of this subject. And newsworthiness, as I said this morning in our presentation, is a vague concept. It is one that has been broadly interpreted by the courts in invasion of privacy lawsuits. But newsworthiness, to be sort of simple and concise about it, are you interested? Am I interested? Clearly, we were all interested in what was going on in Waco, Texas. We decide to cover that story from a certain perspective. People magazine delivers personality journalism, and we were going to approach that story from the perspective of who is David Koresh, who are the Branch Davidians. Give us some history, but give us a sense, moreover, of what led to this event at this moment today. You know, what factors, what forces, what combination of individuals. We have a news bureau system. We have bureaus, regional offices in pretty much every major city, and we deployed our reporters out of Houston and nearby communities who could be on the scene quite quickly and deliver the material in a pretty expedient manner.
Do you ever decide that something is not newsworthy after you've deployed your reporters? You decide this really isn't what we thought it was going to be, and then you sort of cancel the story.
Absolutely. I mean, does the story hold up? We may see a story, and there's a kind of a food chain to this process, but a story may appear in the Coeur d'Alene paper. It then may appear in a slightly larger paper. We may become aware of it at some point, we hope, early on rather than later. And we hope that story will bear out, but often when we get on the scene, the story isn't accurate, or there are further complexities or wrinkles that make it not appropriate to pursue. Not appropriate to pursue primarily because of questions of accuracy.
Would you explain also to our viewers what you mean by personality journalism?
The emphasis in People magazine is on the person. I've described it as a form of psychobiography. a sort of a sort of psychological approach to a story. I mean, we want to know what the personal or emotional bottom line is in any story. An example I've used over and over again, and I will be very quick about it, is Candy Lightner in Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Time, our sister publication, Newsweek, certainly many publications, large and small, approached the story from the perspective of the economic toll on the nation. Certainly stories were heavily laden with statistics. We went in and certainly brought to bear in our story the statistics, the economics, but we tried to focus on Candy Lightner. What was it in her life, clearly the death of a child, that motivated her to activism and advocacy and to form an organization which had an impact on this nation?
Steve Sheen.
Maria, you did an excellent job today, I think, in setting a background for your presentation that fits in well with what we're talking about in the series, which is privacy. I wonder if you'd take just a few minutes to take us through the description you gave of celebrities, who they are and why they seek publicity, and then also talk about the legal protection or lack of it that public figures have.
Well, I think let me start backwards. The courts, as one of people's attorneys has said, leave this whole area, the area of invasion of privacy, as wide open as a big barn door. Rarely are there legal constraints in doing stories about public figures, because the courts have interpreted the law to mean that public figures and anything they do are inherently newsworthy. But newsworthiness in itself is a vague concept, and one that really is open to very broad interpretation and has been open to broad interpretation by the courts. People magazine focuses on celebrities, certainly, but it's only about 40% of our content. We have a range of stories of human interest, but to confine the discussion momentarily to celebrities, celebrities increasingly see an interview as a business transaction. There are things that they want out of that interview. They want to push a product. The commodity often is themselves. That's celebrity. And they expect that the story will be favorable, that the story will be timed to their movie, to their album, to their TV show. And People magazine has another pressure. I mean, we have to deliver stories to our readers that penetrate, punctuate, somehow get behind the public facade. And so that's a sort of a tension inherent in that situation, and a tension that I think is often really quite palpable.
If you would, take us just a little bit further, and again, I'm going to reference your presentation today. You talked a little bit about the standards that people set and that you set for yourself when you evaluate news, even involving personalities or celebrities, multiple sources, newsworthiness, et cetera. Would you talk a little bit?
Well, I also try to distinguish what we do from the tabloids. We don't dress up as doctors and go into hospital rooms. We don't pay sources. We do not misidentify ourselves. We don't hire helicopters and swoop down on weddings. We go in the front door. We identify who we are. We say why we're there, why we want to do this story, and we take it from there. I mean, we expect an equitable journalistic transaction. We had an incident recently where one of our Los Angeles reporters, in the middle of an interview, was chastised by a very famous story subject who I will not mention. And this fellow got up from his chair and said, "Look, you're here to promote my career." And our reporter said, "Excuse me, I think you have me confused with your publicist." What we do is journalism, personality journalism, but journalism. And our reporters are as professional, as experienced, as across the board honorable in the pursuit of this craft as reporters you will find at any other national news organization.
Ms. Wilhelm, what we've done on this program for years is looked at what we consider principles or constitutional issues, and certainly this week at North Dakota College in the 6th week of this series is on one of those, privacy. And oftentimes we contend that there are constitutional principles that are on a collision course, and we often think of that in terms of freedom of the press versus the right of a person to get a fair trial without too much pretrial publicity. Another question is, of course, in the media covering public figures and celebrities, which comes under freedom of the press, but also the right of those individuals to privacy. You articulated with a great accuracy this morning, I think, some principles that apply that some media use in trying to determine where that line is and when do you cross that line in relation to invading privacy. I would appreciate if you would share those with our viewers.
Well, I think I also tried to say that the legal constraints are very few. So this is not a question, the whole invasion of privacy dispute, which can be handled by pointing to the courts, really. I think it comes down to judgment on a case-by-case basis. Is this information necessary to the story? Is it contextually valid? Is it accurate? Certainly. I mean, is it fair? Is it something that is tasteful, for example? I mean, we're all dealing with the constraints, really, of our own publications. People magazine, I like to say, really knows what it is. We know who we are as a publication. And consequently, we do stories that our readers expect. We hope to surprise them at times, certainly, but we hope not to do stories which, which they find as a very hard left curve. Stories that deliver on the personal aspect of the news. But again, I think if I had to enunciate a sort of thesis point, I mean, we are marketplace driven, certainly. I mean, that is not something that I think any publication, any business which has to grapple with a bottom line is going to be reluctant about saying. So within the bounds of taste, of the necessities of a particular publication, and the story, accurate, contextually valid, interesting / newsworthy, we publish our material. And and again, I think every publication faces the same kind of restraints and constraints, though not legal.
Although I think you've been very accurate in describing that the courts have given great leeway to publishing, there are some restraints, and that has to do with the area of libel or slander and so forth. Could you explain to our viewers when you think that a particular article or publication, I'm not speaking of People magazine, but when that line could be crossed, and how your legal staff sets some guidelines to assist?
Well, there's a very quick example in the Handbook of Publishing Law, which I will crib from, and I think this was an interesting one, a small paper in California, I believe a college paper. The school staff did an article about one of the fellows, one of the women running for student body president, who turned out not to be a woman. I think the court in that case found that this information about this student's personal life was not really pertinent or applicable to the office for which this student was running, and the story about this student's campaign. That was an invasion of privacy case for which the court found. The court has, for example, in a case against Sports Illustrated in 1975, Sports Illustrated is our sister publication, articulated a standard by which the material contained in a story to violate privacy would have to be offensive to the average reader. But I also tried to, in our discussion this morning, bring up the point that the average reader's interpretation of what is intimate and offensive is also subject to change, that the press really is barometric. The press really gauges and reflects changing social mores. So really, some of the stuff that we might report, today that we consider, sort of a matter of kind of common parlance, may have been looked at in a rather different way decades before. Also, take it from a different perspective, the kind of hands-off attitude of the press during the Kennedy era, the kind of clubby, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, overly cozy relationship between the press and the people that the press covered, is also something today that we don't particularly tolerate. That's also given rise to, as Larry Sabato, a very, very thoughtful professor at the University of Virginia, given rise to what he calls junkyard dog journalism, which in many ways is a response to the years where journalists lay down and play dead.
You certainly have triggered something, and you've already made this comment, but I got from what you are saying that as cultural values evolve and there's some changes, something that could have been libelous 30 years ago, because of how society would react to that person being described that way, today it may not be libelous because that is an acceptable attitude.
It's difficult for me to speak about libel specifically. I want to make the point that I'm not a lawyer, I'm a reporter. But certainly our understanding of what's offensive and intimate shifts and changes. For example, the term homosexual, communist, in the 1950s had a kind of damning power that clearly those references do not today. And I would be interested to have a lawyer, and I should not comment on this, talk a bit about defamation suits, and again how our understanding of what's intimate, offensive, and what defames has changed.
Thank you. Janelle Burt.
Do you think we've become desensitized in a way to the written word? Are there certain subjects that over the years we have become acquainted with that would have been shocking when we first heard about them, but that now are much less shocking? And as a part of that, today, as you addressed the students, you told some of the history of People magazine, and you have indicated already on the program that you know who you are at People magazine. All of those things, putting them together, can you respond?
I don't want to use the words desensitized or use the word desensitized. I would again, in speaking of this sort of barometric function of the press, put emphasis on what the areas that we are now sensitized to. For example, the women's movement, was clearly a factor in our growth and what we bring to our jobs. We are, sensitized to certain references. I think the women's movement prompted possibly an examination of politicians' personal lives in a way that politicians' lives may not have been examined before. Extramarital dalliances, for example. Certainly we heard a lot about that last year during the campaign. And though the debate on private morality and public duty, or the sort of application of private standards to public life, is really very much an open one, I think, again, as society changes, as sexual mores change, as we see each new cultural shift, we change too, and we reflect that in our pages. But have we become desensitized as well? I think there are many who would argue, as Anna Quindlen in the New York Times did recently in a very, very, very touching, very moving and thought-provoking column, that why is it that we now focus on the story of pre-adolescent murder, that the teenage murderer isn't good enough, that the rape, as I've termed it, on 3rd Street is a 2-inch story, but if it happens in Central Park, and with many offenders, then are we more interested? Is one story less important? Is one story less tragic? I think it's a valid point to raise that in a competitive media market, as we jostle with each other to command and keep readers and viewers, do we up the ante?
Steve Sheen.
That's an interesting area that you've gotten into, Maria. I think that there's always been a debate as to whether the media creates an appetite for what it sells, or whether they merely respond to that appetite which already exists in the general public. let me ask you to respond to that first, and then maybe I can follow up a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very tough question, and I think, as you know, that is a debate that is ongoing, and I don't think that there really is any one response. As you said earlier, what People magazine does is deliver a bit of what used to go on over the back fence, that we are interested in people. We're interested in how those people got to where they are. Certainly there are many, many more publications of the sort, many publications which deal with personality journalism than there were when we started out almost 20 years ago. It is a media-dense environment, and I think a media-dense environment, where competition is particularly intense in a time of limited resources, limited money. I don't know that I can address the kind of cart before the horse aspect of your question, on which there clearly is a lot of sociological debate. What I can tell you is that that people do seem to have a sort of endless, inexhaustible appetite for information about other people. And is that important? In many cases, yes.
I'll give you another opportunity to answer the same question. I don't think you were being evasive at all before. I think it was an excellent answer. How many copies does People sell?
Well, People will, the issue of People you see on the newsstand this week will reach 29 to 30 million people, and that is with a pass-around rate.
An extremely successful publication.
Yes.
And I think a very high-quality publication.
We hope so.
If you accept the argument that, and I think it's true, that the media in general is under some pressure and criticism today, does it concern you that you may be tarred with the same brush as other very successful publications? The National Enquirer, Star types of publications that don't have anything like the same standards, and yet, as I say, are also extremely successful, sell millions and millions of copies.
No, I don't think we're concerned at all that we will be tarred with the same brush, because what we do is very different, and the standards that we adhere to are very, very different. I think, again, in addressing part of the privacy debate, which is riddled with contradictions. One example I use is during the presidential campaign. 21 million people, let me say that one more time, 21 million tuned in to hear Jennifer Flowers on a current affair. In polling done by the New York Times and CBS following that program, I believe, not entirely sure of my facts, but following that program, I believe 50% of the respondents said that there had not been anything during the campaign which was reported that shouldn't have. 55% said that the press went too far. Now, again, how do we grapple with what clearly is a very, very divided debate? And I'm quite sure that many of the respondents to that question were people who watched Current Affair and Jennifer Flowers.
If I can, Tony, real quickly, another story that you told in your presentation that I enjoyed, and I think it's important for our discussion, is related to the fact that these things are cyclical, that in fact the junkyard dog mentality that maybe we are indeed seeing more of today isn't unique in the history of journalism in this country. There have been other periods. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Not at all. Suzanne Garment of the American Enterprise Institute, in a wonderful article, noted that the press has always had a sort of sensationalist tendency. That is the debate really different? In the years between 1893 and 1993, there has always been an emphasis on personality. There has always been, the attempt to sort of, peek behind the closed curtains, and certainly in periods past. Many would argue that the press has been absolutely scandal-mongering in a way that we maybe are not today.
I have a question that deals with the guidelines that you use in two situations. One would be that if a story breaks about a really well-known, maybe even international public figure that's been in the media many times and is used to dealing with many different types of the media, both live and printed. And another story breaks with an individual that is of a major importance, but it is a private citizen, and they just were at a certain place in a certain time in history, and they've had no background with the media. Do you deal with those two in a different way?
Well, I think the latter example you mentioned, someone has been really catapulted
Yes.
into the status of being a public figure by virtue of that news event. Clearly with your former case, the public figure, the worldwide, widely recognized celebrity, we would feel no hesitation in pursuing that story. And in really, the latter case, we would feel no hesitation in pursuing that story because of its inherent newsworthiness. Do we deal with people who have had experience with the press and those who have not in a different manner? I would say we do not in a truly different manner, though I would hope that any one of our reporters, and I'm speaking as a reporter as well, understands that someone who has not dealt with the press before may not know. I mean, even if I am standing, 2 feet away with notebook in hand and pen scribbling, or I have a tape recorder on, they may not be fully aware of what those comments may look like in print, and that it is our duty, our job really, to emphasize and make sure that someone absolutely is aware they're speaking to a reporter.
Something to help our young journalists that may be watching the program. I was so impressed with your intellectual honesty today when you talked about, as a very young reporter, how you dealt with the story and that you would deal with it different today with the experience you have. Would you share that with our viewers?
I'd be happy to. I also want to say, in preface to this little story, that that I am not, entirely clear. I have not sort of come to, a solid sort of, immovable position on this debate.
And we have about 1 minute.
That there are those who would argue with me that I did the wrong thing. Anyway, very quickly, I interviewed a child who had been missing for 6 months and abducted by a sexual psychopath, abused. She had been returned to her parents. Her parents were not psychologically sophisticated people. With their full permission, with their participation, I interviewed this small child. I had spent time with her parents earlier, and I was very sorry I possibly further traumatized this child.
Thank you for being with us today,
Thank
and
you.
it's been most informative, and we're very appreciative. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the third in a 6-week series on the issue of our dissolving privacy. Please be with us again next week, when we will continue our discussion with another guest. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.